The untold truth behind the killing of Jesse James. How does a man become both dead and alive in the same story? And what secrets were whispered in back rooms that kept this mystery alive for decades? Later in this video, we will pull at the threads of betrayal, false graves, and hidden identities. But for now, ask yourself this: what if everything you thought you knew about Jesse James was wrong? Part 1. The Betrayal at St. Joseph. Have you ever wondered how a man could trust someone enough to let them into his home, only to be struck down by that same hand? What could drive a supposed friend to trade loyalty for a bullet? And what made Jesse James, one of the most feared outlaws in America, so vulnerable on that spring morning in 1882? The story begins in St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse James was living quietly under the name Thomas Howard. He had grown weary of the endless chase and bloodshed. Years on the run had left him paranoid, yet oddly willing to believe in the loyalty of a few close men. Among them were Robert Ford and his brother Charlie. The Ford brothers had wormed their way into Jesse's inner circle. Robert, just 20 years old, played the role of a loyal admirer. He flattered Jesse, studied his habits, and convinced him that he was a trusted ally. But behind the smile was ambition and fear. Robert knew Jesse's legend made him both a dangerous friend and a valuable target. So why did Robert Ford decide to betray Jesse? Was it simple greed, or was it survival? At the time, Missouri's governor, Thomas Crittenden, had placed a bounty on Jesse's head. He wanted the outlaw either captured or killed, and he promised a rich reward for the man who brought Jesse down. Robert Ford saw his chance. But the truth is murkier. Some historians believe Ford was pressured into the act, not just tempted. Killing Jesse might have been less about the money and more about saving his own neck. April 3rd, 1882. Jesse James rose early in his rented home in St. Joseph. It was an ordinary house on Lafayette Street, plain and unremarkable. Jesse, his wife Z, and their 2 children had been living there quietly. That morning, Jesse seemed restless. He read the paper, noticed his name plastered in headlines, and then prepared to tackle chores. He had lived too long in disguise, and the life of a farmer suited him less than the life of an outlaw. Inside the house, Robert and Charlie Ford sat with him, both armed, both nervous. Jesse took off his coat, then removed his gun belt. This was unusual. Jesse was almost never unarmed. Yet on that morning, he seemed relaxed, or perhaps distracted. He noticed a picture frame on the wall that needed dusting. Climbing a chair, he turned his back to the brothers. It was the chance Robert had been waiting for. With a quick draw, Robert Ford raised his revolver. He aimed at the back of Jesse's head. In an instant, the shot rang out. Jesse James collapsed forward, dead before he hit the floor. The man who had robbed trains, outwitted posses, and terrorized banks was gone in a single moment of betrayal. But here is the question: why did Jesse let his guard down? How could a man known for suspicion and caution turn his back on 2 men he barely knew? Some say Jesse had grown tired of running and secretly wanted death. Others suggest he had become careless, no longer fearing betrayal. But there is also the darker idea that Jesse knew exactly what was coming and allowed it. Could it be that Jesse James staged the moment to vanish forever? We will explore that possibility later. The news spread quickly. Robert Ford rushed to claim his prize, expecting to be hailed as a hero. Instead, he found himself despised by the public. Jesse James was no saint, but many saw his death as cowardly, shot in the back, unarmed, in his own home. The press branded Robert Ford the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. Rather than glory, Ford lived under scorn. He would spend the rest of his short life haunted by that label. What makes this betrayal so gripping is not only the act itself, but the contradictions it left behind. Jesse James, the outlaw who could outgun lawmen and escape traps, was undone by a house guest. Robert Ford, who dreamed of fame, instead became an outcast. And Governor Crittenden, who thought he solved a problem, instead helped birth a legend. So how much of this was inevitable? Was Jesse always doomed to fall by betrayal? Or did he, in some way, choose it? And what truths were buried in that little house on Lafayette Street that morning? The answers, as we will see, only lead to more questions. Because even as Jesse's body lay in the parlor, people were already whispering that the dead man on the floor might not be Jesse James at all. And that, my friends, is where the real mystery begins. Part 2. the reward and the politics. What is the price of a man's life? And how much power lies hidden in a reward poster? Was Jesse James really killed by Robert Ford for money, or was something larger at work? To understand the betrayal, we must look at the men behind it. Jesse James was not just an outlaw. He was also a political problem. After the Civil War, Missouri was a state torn in two. Jesse had fought as a Confederate guerrilla, and many of his robberies were seen not only as crimes, but also as lingering acts of rebellion. Union loyalists in Missouri hated him, while former Confederates quietly admired him. Governor Thomas Crittenden wanted to rid Missouri of Jesse James. But why was he so determined? On the surface, it was about law and order. Jesse had robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches, leaving bodies behind. But some historians suggest Crittenden also had political motives. By eliminating Jesse, he could show the nation that Missouri was stable, safe, and free of Confederate outlaws. In short, he wanted to polish his reputation. So, in 1881, Crittenden made a bold move. He reached out to the railroads, who had long been the main victims of Jesse's raids. Together, they pooled money to offer a large reward for Jesse's capture, dead or alive. But here is the strange part. The arrangement was not publicly clear. Some believed the state of Missouri itself was funding the bounty, while others insisted the railroads paid most of it. So who really wanted Jesse dead more, the governor or the corporations? Robert Ford claimed his motivation was the reward. But how much money did he actually receive? The promised figure was $10,000, a fortune in those days. Yet records show Ford never got the full amount. Instead, he and his brother were paid smaller sums, and most of the money disappeared into political hands. So was Ford tricked as well, used as a pawn to remove Jesse while others reaped the benefits? There is also the troubling matter of Ford's deal with Crittenden. Some reports say the governor granted Ford a secret pardon before he even pulled the trigger. In other words, Robert may have killed Jesse knowing he could not be punished. If that is true, then the killing was not just a betrayal, it was a state-sanctioned execution. But here is the puzzle. If Jesse James was such a dangerous criminal, why was the law not able to capture him openly? Why rely on a backroom deal with a young outlaw like Robert Ford? The answer lies in Jesse's reputation. He was too slippery, too quick, too loved by parts of the population. Capturing him alive risked failure, embarrassment, and even sympathy for Jesse. Killing him quietly through betrayal was far cleaner for the politicians. Think about it. Jesse James was gunned down not in a shootout, not in a lawman's ambush, but in his own home while unarmed. The method alone suggests fear, not justice. What were the authorities so afraid of? Perhaps it was not Jesse's gun but his legend. A living Jesse James in custody might have become a folk hero on trial. A dead Jesse James, killed by a supposed friend, sent a very different message. Yet even in death, Jesse slipped through their fingers. The public did not celebrate Robert Ford. Instead, they spat his name. The government's attempt to tidy up a messy outlaw story backfired. Newspapers mocked Crittenden for rewarding a cowardly act. Some even accused the governor of hiding the truth about what really happened that day. This is where the story deepens. For if politics drove the killing, could politics also have fueled the rumors that Jesse survived? Think of it this way. The same men who shaped the story of his death also had reasons to mislead the public. If Jesse was dead, they were victorious. If he had escaped, their power looked weak. So which version was more useful to those in charge? Later in this video, we will explore the whispers that Jesse never died in St. Joseph at all. But before we get there, consider this. Robert Ford thought he was cashing in on a reward, but instead he became one of history's most hated figures. Governor Crittenden thought he solved a problem, but instead he helped fuel a legend that only grew larger after death. So what really triumphed that day? Politics or myth? The answer may rest in the next strange chapter, when Jesse's body was laid out for the public, and some swore it was not Jesse at all. Because if the betrayal and reward were part of a plan, the funeral only raised more questions than it answered. And that is where our journey now takes us. Part 3. The Funeral and the Closed Coffin. How do you bury a legend? And what if the body in the coffin is not the man at all? Jesse James was dead, or so the newspapers claimed. Yet the funeral only added fuel to the whispers that he still lived. What details made people question the body on display? And why did the family choose secrecy at the very moment the world demanded proof? After the shooting in St. Joseph, Jesse's body was placed on a cooling board in the parlor. Neighbors crowded in, desperate to see the infamous outlaw for themselves. The scene was chaotic, part spectacle, part mourning. The authorities wanted the public convinced, yet they controlled access tightly. Jesse's face was shown to some, but not all, and soon rumors spread that the body looked too different, too altered, to be Jesse James. His widow, Z. James, was heartbroken. She agreed to a quick burial in Kearney, Missouri, near Jesse's family farm. But here is the odd part. The coffin was kept mostly closed during the funeral service. Mourners were told not to linger, not to question, not to stare too long. Why would a family hide the face of the man everyone came to see? Some locals later swore that the corpse looked nothing like Jesse. They said the hair was shorter, the scars were missing, and the frame too small. Others whispered that the undertaker had botched the embalming, leaving Jesse unrecognizable. But the whispers continued. If this was really Jesse James, why not prove it clearly? Why such haste and secrecy? There is also the matter of the photographs. A few images were taken of the body, but many doubted their authenticity. The picture that circulated in newspapers was grainy, unclear, and left plenty of room for doubt. Skeptics asked a simple question. If the government wanted to silence rumors, why not provide undeniable evidence? Even stranger was the behavior of Jesse's family. His mother, Zerelda, made fiery statements defending the death, insisting the body was her son's. Yet at times she slipped, making comments that hinted at doubt. Some suggested the family itself helped spread confusion to protect Jesse if he had escaped. Others believed they simply wanted to shield themselves from endless questions. The funeral itself was a spectacle. Thousands of people turned out to pay respects or to satisfy curiosity. Jesse had been both feared and admired, and his burial drew men, women, children, and reporters alike. Yet instead of ending the story, the funeral only deepened the mystery. Closed coffin, quick service, limited viewing, all the ingredients of suspicion. And here lies the puzzle. Why would an outlaw's funeral be so guarded? Usually, when authorities killed a famous outlaw, they put the body on full display, parading it before the public to prove victory. Jesse James was different. He was hurried into the ground, as if someone wanted the matter closed quickly. But why? Some say the answer is simple. Jesse James was so famous that even in death, his family wanted privacy. But others argue the opposite, that the secrecy was a cover for a switch, a staged death, and an escape. Was it possible the man buried in Kearney was not Jesse James at all, but another unlucky soul made to stand in his place? Years later, stories would surface of men claiming they saw Jesse alive after 1882. Neighbors swore they spotted him in Kansas or Texas. Strangers in Oklahoma swore a drifter matched his voice and manner. Each account found fuel in the mystery of that closed coffin, because if the funeral was so tightly controlled, who could say for sure who lay inside? The legend of Jesse James grew after that funeral, not before. His death became the spark that created doubt, suspicion, and endless folklore. And the very funeral meant to end his story may have been the moment his myth was born. So what really lay inside that coffin in Kearney? The body of a betrayed outlaw, or the greatest decoy in American history? Later in this video, we will meet the men who claimed Jesse lived under false names long after 1882. But first, we must examine how those rumors began. In the years immediately following the funeral, when men across the frontier stepped forward and declared, "I am Jesse James." Part 4. The Man Who Wouldn't Die. What happens when a man's death refuses to stick? And why did so many claim to be Jesse James long after 1882? Was it greed, madness, or something more chilling? The possibility that one of them was telling the truth. In the years following the funeral, whispers spread across the frontier. Jesse James had not died in St. Joseph. People said he had escaped. Soon, men began stepping forward, each declaring that he was the real Jesse, alive and in hiding. Some were drifters, some criminals, some ordinary farmers, but all carried the same bold claim. One of the first cases surfaced in the 1890s. A man in Kentucky began telling neighbors that he was Jesse James. He matched certain details of Jesse's past, knew names, and told stories only Jesse's close circle could know. Locals were divided. Some laughed, others swore they believed him. He vanished before authorities could investigate further. Another claimant appeared in Texas. This man, older and grizzled, told stories of raids and robberies with uncanny detail. When pressed, he insisted the man killed in St. Joseph was a decoy, a cousin perhaps, planted to give Jesse a way out. Did this man truly know Jesse's secrets, or had he memorized tales from dime novels? The line between fact and folklore blurred with every retelling. Then came the Oklahoma sightings. More than once, strangers swore they had seen Jesse alive on the open plains. One farmer claimed he shared a drink with him in Guthrie, years after the supposed death. Another swore he saw Jesse at a horse auction, older but unmistakable. Were these men deceived by lookalikes, or had Jesse really slipped the noose of history? The flood of imposters tells us something deeper. Jesse James was not just a man, he was a symbol. To the poor farmer, he was a hero who struck against the railroads. To the lawman, he was a menace who defied justice. When a man carries that kind of weight, his death will never satisfy everyone. Someone will always insist he survived. Yet not all the claimants were harmless storytellers. Some gained real followers. One man in Arkansas declared himself Jesse James and gathered a small circle of believers who treated him with respect, even reverence. When challenged, he gave details about the Ford brothers, about robberies, even about Jesse's childhood farm. How did he know? Either he was Jesse James himself, or he had studied the outlaw with obsessive precision. Here is where the mystery grows. If Jesse really did survive, how did he pull it off? He would have needed a willing family, a staged funeral, and silence from those closest to him. Is it possible that his widow Z, his mother Zerelda, and even his children agreed to the ruse? If so, what did they gain from protecting him? But there is another explanation. The men who claimed to be Jesse James may not have been imposters at all, but men broken by hard lives, choosing to step into the skin of a legend. Think about it. To be Jesse James was to be powerful, feared, remembered. To be an unknown farmer was to be forgotten. Which life would you choose if given the chance? Still, each new claim kept the rumor alive. The more men who came forward, the more people doubted the official story. After all, if so many insisted Jesse lived, could all of them be lying? Or was one telling the truth? This doubt only grew as time passed. Newspapers reported these stories with relish, often without fact-checking. Dime novels repeated them, spreading the idea of Jesse's survival to readers across the country. Every imposter, whether clever or foolish, added fuel to the fire. So what do we make of the men who would not let Jesse James die? Were they opportunists exploiting a famous name? Or were they living proof that the outlaw escaped Robert Ford's bullet? Later in this video, we will turn to the most famous of them all, Frank Dalton, the man who in the 1940s claimed not only to be Jesse, but offered detailed proof to back it up. His story would shake the legend once again, forcing historians to ask a troubling question. What if the outlaw really lived on into the 20th century? Part 5. The Case of Frank Dalton. What would you think if a man in his 90s stood up and declared he was Jesse James? Would you laugh, or would you listen? And what if this man knew things only Jesse could have known? In the 1940s, a frail old man in Texas began claiming that he was the infamous outlaw. His name was Frank Dalton, but he insisted that was only his cover. He said he had lived in hiding for decades, quietly watching the world forget him. Now, in his twilight years, he wanted recognition. He wanted the truth told. Dalton's claims stunned the press. He was over 90 years old, but his memory seemed sharp. He told stories of robberies, named gang members, and recalled events from the Civil War with alarming clarity. Reporters, historians, and curious locals flocked to hear him speak. And here's the strange part. Many walked away convinced. Dalton displayed scars that matched Jesse's known injuries. A bullet wound here, a knife scar there. He spoke of Jesse's farm in Missouri with precise details, describing the layout, the barn, even family quirks. How could a man fabricate such knowledge without having lived it? Skeptics, of course, dismissed him as a fraud. They argued he was a clever old man who had absorbed dime novels, local gossip, and newspaper clippings, weaving them into a convincing tale. Others thought he was simply delusional, desperate for fame in his final years. But the believers pushed back. If Dalton was a fraud, how did he know so much that was never written in the popular accounts? In 1948, Dalton formally declared himself Jesse James before a crowd. Supporters gathered, some even treating him as a celebrity. He signed autographs as Jesse James, posed for photographs, and gave interviews. The legend that had supposedly ended in 1882 was suddenly alive again, walking and talking in full view of the public. Even Jesse's own family could not agree on Dalton. Some descendants dismissed him outright, while others admitted his resemblance and knowledge unsettled them. Zerelda's grandchildren were divided, some swearing Dalton had the look of their kin, others calling him an imposter. So which was it, a blood relative in disguise, or a liar with perfect timing? The case grew more bizarre when Dalton's supporters began pushing for legal recognition. They wanted history rewritten to show that Jesse had not died in St. Joseph, but lived on as J. Frank Dalton. Lawsuits were filed, court hearings were held, and for a moment the possibility that Jesse James had survived became a real legal question. But here is the twist. Dalton's life story outside of his Jesse claim was shaky. Records showed inconsistencies in his past, gaps in his identity, and sudden appearances that left researchers puzzled. Was this because he had been hiding as Jesse James, or because he was reinventing himself over and over? Dalton died in 1951, still claiming he was Jesse. His body was buried under a tombstone that boldly read Jesse Woodson James. To this day, that grave draws visitors, some mocking, some serious, all curious. Imagine standing before it and wondering, is this the outlaw himself, or just the final resting place of a great pretender? Decades later, attempts were made to test Dalton's remains with DNA, but the results were inconclusive. Questions about contamination, poor samples, and conflicting records left no firm answer. Once again, Jesse James slipped through the grip of certainty, just as he had in life. So what do we make of J. Frank Dalton? A fraud who fooled a generation, or the real Jesse who outlived his betrayers? The evidence points in both directions, leaving us in the same place we began, unsure. And that is the power of Jesse's legend. No matter how much proof is presented, doubt always lingers. Later in this video, we will weigh the hard evidence, from autopsies to modern DNA studies, against the mountain of rumors. The historians may have their facts, but the believers have their fire, and somewhere between them lies the truth of whether Jesse James died in 1882 or lived to tell the tale. Part 6. Historians versus believers. What wins in the end, cold facts or burning belief? And how can one man's death split generations between those who trust evidence and those who cling to legend? Jesse James remains that dividing line, and the clash between historians and believers is as fierce today as it was in 1882. Historians rely on the records from St. Joseph. The coroner's report declared Jesse dead. Witnesses, including his wife Z, confirmed the body was his. The burial records match, and the grave in Kearney still bears his name. To them, the case is closed. Robert Ford shot Jesse James, and the outlaw's life ended that morning. Yet believers refuse to accept that conclusion. They point to the inconsistencies, the closed coffin, the odd scars that did not match, and the flood of men who later claimed to be Jesse. To the believers, history books are not evidence. They are controlled stories, shaped by politics and power. If the government wanted Jesse dead on paper, why trust their word? In the late 20th century, modern science entered the debate. DNA testing was performed on remains believed to be Jesse's. The results indicated a close match to the James family line. Historians seized on this as final proof, yet skeptics pushed back, arguing that the tests were incomplete, that the remains could have been switched, and that the chain of custody was questionable. So even science, meant to silence the argument, only fed the fire. What is striking is how much passion fuels both sides. Historians speak with authority, pointing to documents, medical reports, and grave markers. Believers speak with emotion, telling stories of sightings, confessions, and conspiracies. The clash is not just about evidence. It is about trust. Do you trust official history, or do you trust the whispers of neighbors and the persistence of folklore? Think of Robert Ford. History says he killed Jesse for a reward. Yet even that story leaves questions. If Jesse really died, why did Ford end up despised, wandering, and eventually gunned down himself? Believers say it is because Ford never killed Jesse, only a decoy, and his miserable fate was the curse of betraying the story, not the man. The debate also reveals something deeper about America. Jesse James became more than an outlaw. He became a mirror. For some, he was proof of law and order, finally defeated. For others, he was proof that the common man could resist authority and live on in legend. Historians wanted closure. Believers wanted a hero who never died. But here is the irony. Both sides need each other. Without the believers, Jesse James would be just another outlaw in the history books. Without the historians, the legend would drift too far into fantasy. It is the tension between the two that keeps the mystery alive. So what should we trust? The coroner's pen or the whispers of 1,000 witnesses? The DNA sample or the scar on Frank Dalton's chest? The official grave in Kearney or the headstone in Texas? Each piece of evidence collides with another, leaving no clear victor. Later in this video, we will step beyond evidence and belief and ask a final question. Why does Jesse James still matter? Why has his story endured for more than a century? And why does the legend of his death, real or faked, still capture the American imagination? Part 7. The legend that refuses to fade. Why does Jesse James still haunt the American imagination? And what makes his story linger long after his guns went silent? Perhaps the answer lies not in whether he truly died in 1882, but in how his death became a story too good to ever end. Jesse James was not the first outlaw, and he was not the last. Yet his name endures while others fade. Why? Because his tale carried all the ingredients of myth. A Confederate soldier turned bandit, a man hunted by railroads and governors, betrayed by a friend in his own home. It reads less like history and more like a legend passed around a campfire. For the older generation of Americans, Jesse became a symbol of resistance. He fought banks, he fought trains, he fought authority. Whether or not his motives were noble, people admired his defiance. To them, he was not just an outlaw, he was an underdog. When he died, the mystery of his end only magnified that image. And here is the secret of legends. They thrive on gaps. The less we know, the more we wonder. Jesse's closed coffin, the imposters who followed, the claims of Frank Dalton, the split between historians and believers, all created cracks in the story. And in those cracks, legend grew. Folklore has no expiration date. In saloons, in frontier towns, in dusty ranches, people told and retold the tale. Every retelling added a detail, a twist, a new suspicion. Some said Jesse was alive in Texas. Others swore he vanished to Mexico. Still others claimed he wandered the frontier under new names. In truth, it did not matter if any of it was real. What mattered was that people wanted it to be real. Think about it. If Jesse had simply been shot in a train robbery and buried without fuss, his name might have faded into the long list of criminals. But because his death came through betrayal, with politics and secrecy layered on top, it became more than an ending. It became a riddle. Generations later, Hollywood would seize on his story. Films, ballads, and novels turned Jesse into a character larger than life. Even Robert Ford, despised in his own lifetime, became immortalized as the coward who shot Jesse James. When myth takes hold, even villains gain fame. Yet for all the songs and stories, one thing remains clear. Jesse James belongs not to historians or believers, but to the people who kept telling his tale. His death, real or faked, became part of the American fabric. He was outlaw and folk hero, killer and victim, villain and legend, all in one. So what do we truly know? Did Jesse James fall on April 3rd, 1882, or did he ride off into the shadows of history? The records say one thing, the whispers say another. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, hidden by time and protected by the very people who loved him. And maybe that is the point. Jesse James never needed to escape the bullet to live forever. His legend did that for him. Every doubt, every rumor, every supposed sighting only added fuel to the fire. The man may have died, but the story refused to. So ask yourself this: what makes a man immortal, flesh and blood, or memory and myth? Because whether Jesse James died in St. Joseph or lived on as Frank Dalton, the truth no longer matters as much as the tale, and that is why the name Jesse James will never fade.